Over decades of continuous improvement, the Kalashnikov rifle was produced in a variety of colors. After the rejection of wooden parts, it partially became orange, and a later time received a classic black profile. But there was another unusual variety of this rifle, which received purple-colored furniture. For its appearance, it received a nickname Plum. Today, such an AK is one of the most popular among fans, because its unusual coloring doesn't leave anyone indifferent. But few people know how it even appeared. Why did they decide to make the AK look particularly like that? And why was this idea abandoned later? So, the first AK was adopted for service in 1949. Initially, its furniture, that is stock, grip, gas tube cover and handguard, were made of solid birch wood. In the early 50s, the Soviet Union began work on creating an improved version of the Kalashnikov rifle. Under this project, Soviet engineers had to accomplish three tasks: to reduce the cost of the rifle, to reduce its weight without losing its durability, and to make it easier to manufacture. First, they improved the wooden furniture. So since 1955, the parts of the Kalashnikov rifle began to be made of multi-layer birch plywood instead of solid birch. However, this was only an intermediate solution, which allowed to slightly increase the durability of parts. Even then, it was clear that the only way to bring the AK to the required level of performance was to create plastic parts for it. After several stages of experimentation, Soviet engineers found that the most suitable material for this purpose was a plastic called AG4. This is fiberglass, which contains thermosetting phenol formaldehyde resin, better known as bakelite. The first AK parts made of this material appeared in 1959. Interestingly, at the time, even the dust cover was made of it. However, it was later abandoned. The kit of parts itself was quite crude and required modifications. In the same year, the AKM rifle appeared, and modernization of furniture was from then on carried out for this weapon. After 3 years, it was finally possible to finalize and produce the first plastic part. This was the pistol grip, which received a dark cherry color. 2 years after it, the first plastic magazine was created. It, unlike the grip, had the original fiberglass color, yellowish-orange. When creating these and later parts, AG4S material was used. But in addition to it, another subspecies of fiberglass was also tested, AG4V. This material has shorter fibers in its structure, because of which the parts made of it had a very unusual pattern, which was nicknamed Karelian birch. However, they did not go into mass production and were produced only in a limited batch as part of experiments. In 1967, the Soviet Union began developing a new AK-74 rifle. Further development of plastic parts to a large extent began to go within the framework of this model. However, simultaneously with it, Soviet engineers also carried out partial modernization of the old AKM. For example, in the early 70s, new magazines were created for it. Later, these developments would become the basis for the future AK-103 rifle. But let's get back to AK-74. The first parts that the new rifle received were the grip and magazine, which had already been worked out on the old AK. In the mid-70s, polymer furniture KS-30P in brown color were created and tested. However, it didn't go beyond the testing stage. Gradually, it became clear that fiberglass AG4S should be abandoned in favor of a more promising material, polyamide PA6. This was due to several reasons at once. Firstly, AG4 material is very harmful in production and extremely labor-intensive when creating products from it. Secondly, PA6 polyamide has a more ductile structure and has higher durability. It was then that the era of those plum AKs began. In the mid-70s, the first experimental AK-74 magazines made of new material appeared, and a little earlier, a 20-round magazine for the future AK-74U. These magazines, however, remained only experimental products. The first adopted plum parts appeared only in 1983. It was the handguard, gas tube cover, and magazine. 3 years later, the wooden stock and fiberglass pistol grip were also replaced by plum parts. Thus, the Kalashnikov rifle completely switched to plastic furniture. In the late 80s, the RPK and RPK-74 machine guns also received similar parts. The exception was the magazines for the RPK, which remained orange until the appearance of the RPK-203 in the 2000s. The AKS-74U rifle, which appeared in the late 70s, almost immediately received a plum-colored magazine and grip. It was planned to introduce plastic handguard with drip surface, as on the RPK-74, but due to economic reasons, this idea was abandoned. So why was such an unusual color chosen for the AK furniture? In fact, it's very simple. Back in 1965, SOET engineers found out that adding dye to plastic parts reduces their strength. It required time to perfect the technology, and then the SOET engineers simply could not get parts of black color. Therefore, at first, they started to introduce furniture in AKs without adding dye, that is, of yellowish-orange color. Then, in the late 70s, they managed to create parts that would have a darker, close to black color, but would still have the same high performance. That color turned out to be brown. However, under the influence of technological processes, the color of the material changed and began to take on more of a cherry or purple hue. After a while, it was nicknamed plum. Furniture for AK rifles and RPK machine guns were produced in this unusual color until the early 90s. Around 1991, the plum parts on the AK-74 were replaced by black ones. Then, the AK-74M appeared. It, and all subsequent modifications of the Kalashnikov rifle, began to be made in the classic black color. Despite the fact that today the plum AK is increasingly difficult to find in armies, every year its original look and aesthetics attracts more and more fans. The fashion for such parts in the civilian market is not only continuing, but gaining momentum, and I'm glad that now you can learn a little more about this unusual AK. That's all for today. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe to the channel. See you next week.